A black man like you walking through downtown in a suit. Around here, your kind stays on the curb. That's what the white cop sneered, practically spitting the words before twisting the man's arm and cuffing him in broad daylight like he was garbage. The crowd watched in silence, assuming it was just another case of racial profiling. But minutes later, those smug cops turned pale when they found out the man they just humiliated was actually the city's mayor. A brutal slap in the face to the system and a lesson they'll never forget. What state are you watching from? Do you still believe justice exists in America? Comment below if you've ever witnessed injustice like this and watched to the end to see the twist that silenced the entire country. The stone steps in front of City Hall still held the damp breath of the morning, reflecting a cold metallic light. Marcus Hale stepped out, his charcoal vest fitting snugly across his broad shoulders. A deep blue Lee adjusted with exact precision, his polished black shoes imprinting each measured stride onto the now busy Main Street. He was neither hurried nor leisurely. His pace carried a cadence that made anyone watching know this was a man who understood exactly where he was going and why. But across the street, two figures in navy uniforms had stopped. A glint of light slid across the forehead of the taller one, followed by a probing gaze that swept down over the suit, the leather briefcase, then climbed back up to Marcus's face. No visible sign of criminality, yet it was enough to kindle in their eyes that old suspicion etched deep into habit. Officer Shouter, the name many used because his voice was as loud as a barked order, stepped off the curb, cutting through the flow of pedestrians crossing the street. He said nothing at first, simply closing the distance toward Marcus, the burnt bitter smell of coffee on his breath spilling into the space between them. Then he stopped so close that the flap of his uniform brushed the buttons of Marcus's vest. His index finger, broad and calloused, jabbed straight into Marcus's chest, not with force but with enough warning that a single wrong move would turn that touch into a shove meant to knock him off balance. Marcus stopped, his eyes locked on the man's face, and did not take a step back to the left. Officer Pusher, shorter but square-shouldered, his frame solid as a brick, did not approach immediately. He circled the parked patrol car, his left hand sweeping across its side while his right palm slapped hard against the door. The metallic thud rang sharp, rippling down the street like a bell, announcing the start of an inspection. The sound made a few passers-by glance over, but most only quickened their pace as if accustomed to this wordless ritual officers used when selecting a target. Marcus did not flinch. He simply stood there, back straight, chin slightly lifted, his dark eyes catching the morning light and turning it into twin shards of steel. His composure was not the kind meant to ease tension. It was the silent fortification of an ancient stone wall, unmoving, impenetrable, forcing anyone who might test it to wonder if they had the strength. Shouter tilted his head, letting a half-smile curl across his mouth, the kind worn by a man convinced he stood above. His voice broke through the thick air between them. "You think this suit makes you untouchable?" Each word hissed through clenched teeth, laced with contempt and provocation like a hook swung at a man's dignity. Marcus let a beat pass as if allowing the question's echo to fade entirely, then replied. His voice was low, steady, not louder than it needed to be, but enough to press over every other sound. "It's not the suit, it's who's in it." The answer dropped into the tension-strung space, like a marker driven into the ground. Clear, unyielding. Shouter's eyes faltered for a fraction of a second, as if he hadn't expected his opponent to counter with a blade so sharp. But he quickly pulled his expression tight again, holding on to his air of superiority. From behind, Pusher shifted a step, his hard-soled shoes grinding against the pavement with a dry scrape, a percussion to his slow encroachment. Marcus remained motionless, his breathing steady and deep, each measured expansion of his chest declaring that no one but himself would dictate this moment. The air thickened around them, the faint breeze from the far end of the street too weak to cut the knife sensation in the air. Every passing glance knew that a boundary was being tested. And then, as if to confirm it, Shouter raised his right hand, bringing it behind his back, fingers curling around the cold, short chain. A glint flashed off the steel of the handcuffs, catching the morning sun, cold and sharp, as a suspended sentinel. The cold glint of the handcuffs still hung in the air for a moment, as if weighing which wrist to claim first. But Shouter allowed no pause to dissolve. One step forward, a sudden pull from behind, and Marcus's hand was twisted back, forced forward against the patrol car's hood. The faint knock of metal against the painted surface rang out sharp and dry like a full stop they intended to carve into the morning. Pusher moved in from the left, his solid bulk casting a shadow over Marcus's back, and without hesitation, his weight bore down, pressing Marcus's chest and shoulders flush against the cold steel. The metal reflected each breath, but what they wanted him to feel was not the chill of steel. It was the suffocating pressure of blind power. Marcus did not struggle, did not twist, did not make any movement that could become their excuse to escalate the violence. He let Pusher's weight press down, and from that position of forced restraint, his voice rose slow and deliberate, each word dropping like a pebble onto the surface of a still lake. Check my identity. It was not a plea, not a timid request, but a command from a man who knew his worth and his standing. But Shouter let out a short laugh, its tone sharpened over the years with contempt. We don't need to. We know what you are. His voice was like a dull blade dragged across glass, enough to send a shiver up the spine of anyone standing close. From his perspective, any protest was nothing but meaningless noise. In his eyes, this man was not a mayor, not a figure of authority, only a subject he believed he had the right to define. Marcus tilted his head, turning just enough to look directly at the man who had spoken the insult. His gaze did not waver, did not blink, as if holding it steady until Shouter had no choice but to realize who was truly observing whom. No, you don't. 4 simple words. Yet they dropped like a pillar onto the entire scene, dampening every sound around them. A breeze from the end of the street lifted a few scraps of old newspaper, but it could not sweep away the taut confrontation strung like wire between 2 men on opposite sides of the law. Pusher, as if to further assert his physical dominance, tightened the hold on the arm he had wrenched back, forcing Marcus even closer against the hood. The handcuffs clinked as they shifted on his wrist, the sound crisp and precise enough to carry several yards down the street. Each brush of metal against skin became an invisible mark, not on the wrist, but in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Still, Marcus did not resist. He let his silence become his protest, stretching the space between his last words and their next move into an uncomfortable void. But Pusher paid no mind to that void. He gripped Marcus's arm and pulled hard toward the patrol car's door, each step taken as if escorted in a dangerous criminal. His grip was so tight the knuckles turned white, and with every pull, the scrape of his shoes against the asphalt merged with the clink of the cuffs, forming an intentional rhythm of confinement. In the morning light, their shadows stretched long across the pavement, one tall, straight, and unmoving, flanked and dragged by 2 others. Somewhere, in the glint of sunlight bouncing off the metal, the truth still stood unshaken. But the escort continued, leading straight to the open car door where all their intentions were about to meet a reality they had not anticipated. The patrol car door closed halfway like a promise that would be completed in a few beats, but the space between the act and its outcome was enough to send the first ripples across the crowded sidewalk. At first, glances were nothing more than quick flickers. Then they began to linger longer, as if people had just realized what was unfolding at the center of the street's frame. A man in a suit pinned between 2 police officers, his arms wrenched behind him, his back pressed against the hood, his head lowered under the weight but his chin still holding a proud angle. Footsteps that had been hurrying past began to slow, the curve of bodies along the sidewalk tightening into a half-moon, widening with each second as more people stopped. Marcus's silence stood in complete contrast to the raw, aggressive energy radiating from the 2 officers, making the air between them tilt precariously like an overstrained wire. Shouter leaned his head close to Marcus's ear, his breath hot against the skin just below the jawbone, and growled, "Shut your mouth." The sound did not just cut through Marcus's ear. It was aimed to pierce the hearing of those standing a few yards away, a deliberate warning that any voice raised in interference would be crushed. But Marcus did not answer. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, the breath sank into the bottom of his lungs before rising back up, released light and steady. In that moment, anyone watching closely could see he was not trembling, not hesitating. He was locking every reflex away to deny them the chance to turn him into an excuse. Pusher, standing opposite, decided to push the escort further. A sharp drive of his hip paired with a yank on the arm made Marcus's shoe slide a short distance across the pavement. The scrape of leather soles against concrete rang sharp and dry, leaving a faint dark streak where long settled dust had been swept away. Pusher drove his hand into Marcus's shoulder, each finger hooking into the fabric of the vest. Squeezing so tightly the fibers began to crease. His stance was not that of a man merely trying to maintain control of a situation. It was the stance of someone parading a freshly caught criminal, and he wanted everyone here to believe it. Marcus turned his head slightly, his eyes open, and again not to look at the one restraining him, but at Shouter, who still wore that half-smile as if victory was already his. Marcus's voice dropped low enough for only the intended ear to hear, yet sharp enough to cut through the arrogance behind the badge. Your badge won't save you from what's coming. The words were like a stone dropped into a deep well, taking a few seconds to hit bottom. But when they did, the echo came back heavy and cold. The crowd began to murmur, no longer just curious, but now laced with looks of disapproval, suspicion, and then from somewhere beyond the ring of onlookers, a shout rang out, clear and sharp as a blade slicing through the thick air. Hey, I know him. That shout instantly pulled every gaze in the same direction. And in that split second, the space that had been nothing more than a backdrop became an invisible iron cage where every movement, every word, every breath was trapped, waiting for the next moment to strike. The shout recognizing Marcus tore through the heavy shroud of silence around the scene the instant it rang out, like a spark falling into a chamber, thick with gasoline fumes. Dozens of eyes caught between curiosity and unease suddenly converged on a single point. And at that point, all the light was drawn toward the man pinned between two police officers. From the edge of the crowd, a woman's voice rang out clear and decisive enough to swallow even the distant hum of traffic. That's Mayor Marcus Hale. Just 4 words, but they carried the weight to shatter the entire script Shouter and Pusher had been constructing. The atmosphere they had been controlling through physical intimidation flipped instantly. The people watching were no longer passive spectators, but witnesses to an act committed against the highest authority in the city. Shouter froze for a fraction of a second. The smirk he fought to keep on his face was a coat of paint beginning to crack as sweat gathered in tiny beads on his forehead, sliding slowly down his temple, catching the sunlight like shards of glass. He shot a glance at Pusher, his eyes sending the order to press on before the situation slipped beyond control. But Pusher, too, had felt the change in the air. His gaze swept over the crowd. Then he tightened the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, as if to etch one last mark of authority onto this man. The clink of metal returned, but this time it no longer rang with the certainty it had before. It sounded like chains clashing in a prison that had just been unlocked. Laced with a tension that could not be hidden, Marcus did not resist, but neither would he allow himself to be turned into a display piece for their oppression. He lifted his head slowly, the motion bringing the morning light straight onto his face, outlining every defined line. His eyes deep and still as a lake before a storm. Even under restraint, his shoulders held a straight, unshaken line, as if the weight of the entire moment was still not enough to break him. When the light had revealed his face in full, Marcus spoke. His voice did not need volume, but each syllable struck into the air like a hammer against steel. Now you know my name. Soon you'll know my reach. The words were not aimed only at the 2 men holding him, but at everyone watching, both on this street and through the hundreds of phone cameras raised to capture the moment. It was no empty threat, but a declaration condensed into 10 words, enough to plant in every listener's mind the question of the true power they were facing. Shouters swallowed hard, and though he tried to maintain a defiant stare, his pupils had widened, an involuntary reflex when the body senses a real threat. He regained his voice and shouted, "Step back. Everyone step back." But the tone no longer carried seamless authority. It was a mix of aggression and a flicker of panic, like a cornered animal still trying to bare its teeth. His voice echoed through the live streaming lenses, inadvertently exposing the unsteadiness in an attitude long trained to dominate. At one corner of the street, a young reporter had already raised her camera. The lens swept over the crowd and then locked in, slowly zooming in on Shouter's face. On the screen, every detail was sharp. The beads of sweat, the twitch at the corner of his mouth, and the eyes that no longer held certainty. Viewers watching from home would not see an untouchable officer, but a man being forced to swallow the very narrative he had tried to force onto someone else. And at the center of that frame behind him, Marcus stood still, his face turned directly to the lens, letting the light and the truth do their work. The echo from the close-up pan across Shouter's face on the live stream screens had not yet faded when a sudden movement cut through the ring of onlookers, swift and clean like an arrow shot through the air. A city hall staffer, trim in a silver gray suit, broke from the crowd and stepped forward. His face was tense, but his eyes shone with the clarity of someone who had already decided exactly what he was going to do. No one had time to ask, and no one stepped in to stop him because the moment felt like a live circuit waiting for that final touch to flare it to life. He moved in close to Marcus, leaning slightly so that his hands slid into the left pocket of Marcus's vest, the motion decisive and precise, leaving no pause for hesitation. A plastic card slid out, catching the sunlight like a blade flashing in the light. Against its stark white background, the word mayor was printed in bold, so clear there could be no claim of a mistaken raid. The card spun lightly in the staffer's hand, each turn sweeping a streak of dazzling light across the crowd and straight into the recording lenses. In that instant, the question of who was controlling the situation reversed entirely. It was no longer the handcuffs that held the power, but that small card deciding who truly had authority. Marcus did not need to snatch the card back, nor did he need to speak at length. He simply turned his head, locking eyes with Shouter, letting a short silence hang like a deep breath before a strike. His voice came not loud but crisp and strong enough to tear straight through the tension. Told you to check it, each word like a bullet lodging in memory, replaying the moment he had given them a chance to keep their dignity and the moment they chose to ignore it. Pusher, on Marcus's right, reacted on instinct. He stepped back half a pace, not much, but enough to loosen the cuff on Marcus's wrist. His fingers still gripped tight, but the ironclad arrogance was gone, replaced by a slackness the sharper eyes in the crowd could spot instantly. A wave of murmurs broke out, and then, as if cued by some unseen signal, the crowd erupted into cheers and shouts. The cheering surged from the front, spilling to both sides, and rolled back like waves hitting a seawall. The shouts intertwined, jagged, sharp, and cutting, driving straight into the ears of the two officers. Shouter clenched his jaw, the muscles standing out sharply beneath skin slick with sweat. His gaze did not move toward the car. He avoided it deliberately, as if even a glance would make his defeat official before hundreds of witnesses and thousands watching online. But it was that very avoidance that became the loudest confession, exposing that the badge on his chest now weighed less than half an ounce of fragile plastic. A click rang out, clean and sharp like a safety latch snapping open. The camera had just captured an image that could never be bought back. The glowing mayor ID card in the sunlight right beside the cold steel of the handcuffs locked on Marcus's wrist. In the frame, one side held the emblem of power granted by the people, the other, the instrument of power abused, and all of it sealed in a single image, ready to spread across social media in seconds. At the center of that moment, the balance had tipped, and there was no way to pull it back toward those rapidly losing their ground. Less than 15 minutes after the photograph of the mayor ID pressed against the steel handcuffs surfaced, it had already claimed the headlines of countless social media accounts, shared, colored, blown up, spliced into hundreds of memes, and tagged with hashtags rocketing upward as if strapped to jet engines. Leading them was Shocker, Mayor in Cuffs, a visual campaign ignited not by any organization, but by a community's collective outrage bursting into full force. In a clip cut from the live stream, Shouter forced Marcus's head down against the hood, the tendons in his hands standing out, the sunlight catching on the cuffs in sharp glints, as if underlining each passing second. That frame, stripped of the street's background noise, became a visual emblem of abuse of power, pinned as a cover photo on thousands of profiles, turning Shouter's act of aggression into an indictment he could never scrub away. As the hashtag spread, another video abruptly pushed into the raging stream, taking the story from heated to blazing. A face appeared in frame, gray hair, deep-set eyes, and the low voice of a former police officer. "I warned about these two 10 years ago," he began without preamble. In a 3-minute statement, he recounted how he had been threatened and even reassigned for filing a report on Shouter and Pusher's misconduct. "They told me to keep quiet, because that's how things work around here," he said, his eyes fixed on the lens. Each word weighted like lead. The clip was shared at a dizzying pace, attached to snippets of the morning's live stream as part of a growing chain of evidence linking past and present. In a small cafe, a few blocks from City Hall, Marcus sat alone at a window table. He didn't read every post, only scrolling through headlines, images, and excerpts on his phone. When the frame of Shouter forcing his head down, now the cover image for Mayor in Cuffs, appeared, Marcus's lips curved faintly. It wasn't quite a smile of satisfaction, but a quiet acknowledgement that the wave was forming on its own, and he didn't need to set sail to catch it. His finger paused on the video of the former officer. His gaze softened for a moment, then the faint smile returned, thin as a blade sharpened to a fine edge. Not far away, under the hum of artificial light, Shouter sat at his desk, typing mechanically, as if work were proceeding as usual. But every browser tab was open to the same thing. The clip of his morning actions with hundreds of new comments flooding in every minute. One line popped up in front of him. How does it feel to be the disgrace of the city? Just 12 words, but they struck at the deepest place he wanted hidden. He tried to smirk, but the reflection on his screen revealed a taut face, the twitch at the corner of his eye, and a bridge of his nose damp with sweat. Pusher couldn't hold himself together. He shot up from his chair, the scrape of its legs against the floor loud enough for the next room to hear. His hand slammed onto the desk with a force that carried through the walls. Then he shouted, "This is out of control." His voice was a mix of fury and panic, the sound of someone realizing the game was no longer in his hand. But the echo of that desk slam couldn't drown out the steady chime of new message notifications leaping from his phone, each one sending a fresh spike through his temple. And then amid the chaos of incoming data, one notification stood out across countless devices. An anonymous account, no profile picture, no personal information. Its follower count surging by the second, posted a short clipped statement, evidence enough to bury their careers. We'll release when the time is right. That was all, but it landed like a spark into a powder magazine already primed to blow. In less than a minute, the post had been shared thousands of times, each share carrying another theory, a promise, or an outright condemnation. And as the sun dipped on its arc, the story was no longer just about that morning. It had become a storm big enough to swallow the entire city. The storm raging online continued to widen its spiral, but Marcus showed no sign of a public reaction. When major news outlets tried to crowd his doorstep, he simply walked past, his stride steady, his gaze forward, a neither explanation nor rebuttal. In the small third-floor office at City Hall, his advisor had laid out a stack of morning papers, their front pages dominated by the image of Shouter forcing his head onto the hood of the patrol car. Marcus glanced at them for a moment, then said flatly, his voice low and cold, "Let them choke on their panic." It was not avoidance, it was timing, letting their chaos dismantle the defenses they believed unshakable. That afternoon, he left City Hall without announcing an itinerary, carrying only a slim leather briefcase. An unmarked car took him to a small house in the southern outskirts of the city. The house was worn, its walls stained by time, but as the door opened, a middle-aged man stepped out, eyes bright but lined with the fatigue etched deep over the years. He was a witness to a case from 10 years ago, an injustice carried out by Shouter and Pusher. In the cramped living room, only 2 wooden chairs were facing each other, and a scratched table. No embellishment, no ceremonial preparation. The man poured Marcus a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly, revealing the long scar running down his right arm, the mark that had changed the course of his life. He began to speak, his voice slow but deliberate, as if afraid to leave out a single detail. That night he had been stopped on his way home, carrying nothing but a grocery bag. Shouter had rushed in first, Pusher close behind, and before he could even ask what's going on, a blow shattered his arm. The cold bite of steel shackles and the snap of the cuffs were still vivid in his mind, along with the fabricated charge that he had assaulted a police officer. Every step of the process that followed had been arranged, the real witnesses pushed aside, the records altered, and a criminal conviction hanging over his honor like a suspended death sentence. Marcus listened, his hand never leaving the recorder on the table. He didn't interrupt, didn't nod or shake his head, letting the voice flow into the device like a stream of living evidence. When the story paused, he asked a single even-toned question, his voice like steel. "Do you still have anything?" The man was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Shouter was beginning to feel the weight of sleepless nights. He sat in a dark kitchen, draining a bottle of hard liquor, his glass filling and emptying in turns. Each time he closed his eyes, the image of Marcus's face that morning came back, along with the roar of the crowd and the flash of the mayor card. The house that had once been full was now empty. His wife had left with a cold parting line, "I'm not living with a man like you anymore." Pusher's decline was different. He still showed up at the station, but the look in his colleagues' eyes had changed. No one greeted him as before. Conversations died when he entered a room, and the space at the lunch table stretched like an invisible punishment. The avoidance spread like an infection, turning each day into a silent sentence. The meeting in the small house lasted another hour. When Marcus rose to leave, the man opened an old cabinet, pulling out a thick envelope, and from it a black USB drive, worn but still capped. He held it in Marcus's hand, his gaze steadier than when he had begun his story. "Everything is in here. They tried to erase it, but I kept it." Marcus closed his fingers lightly around the USB, feeling the weight of it far exceed its few grams of plastic and metal. He gave a single nod, said nothing more, and stepped out of the house, leaving behind the sound of the door closing, dry and firm, like a confirmation that the levee had begun to crack. The black USB drive Marcus had brought back did not sit in a drawer for more than a night. The next morning in his office, lit only by the muted glow of a single desk lamp, and with the curtains drawn tight, he plugged it into his computer. A long list of files appeared on the screen, but his eyes fixed on one alone. Bodycam 1706, 8 years ago. One click, and the monitor jolted to life with murky, grainy images and the rapid, panicked breathing of a child. The footage shook violently as if the camera's wearer were running or struggling to stay upright. And amid the chaos came the boy's voice, shattering the stillness of the room. "Please, I didn't do anything." The voice was young, fragile, but laced with a terror so absolute it dragged behind it the clang of metal on metal and the pounding steps of someone closing in. Marcus sat upright, his gaze locked to the screen. The light from the clip washed across his face, catching in the dark of his eyes another kind of light, the glow of rage compressed to its limits. In the frame, the silhouettes of Shouter and Pusher loomed, their bodies blocking half the view, but enough was visible to catch every blow. They landed on an unarmed boy. Kicks slid across asphalt, leaving a smear of blood that spread as quickly as red ink on blotting paper. There was no lawful warning, no move of self-defense from the child, only two uniformed figures crushing a life that hadn't yet had the chance to grow. When the evening news aired the leaked footage that same day, the city reacted as if doused with a bucket of ice water. In his apartment, Shouter was sitting in front of the TV when that frame appeared. He shot to his feet, snarled a curse, and swung his arm through the screen. Glass shards sprayed outward, power cables tore loose, but the boy's screams stayed in his head, louder than any verdict a court could deliver. His breath came in ragged bursts, sweat mixing with the blood from a fresh cut on his hand, and he couldn't tell which pain was from the body and which from the thing eating him alive inside. In another house, Pusher was eating dinner when his teenage son set his chopsticks down, his eyes wide with disbelief, and asked, "Dad, is that you?" The question didn't need a question mark. The voice already carried the answer. Pusher choked, trying to speak, but finding his throat dry, and suddenly the space between father and son felt longer than the 8 years since that night. Marcus wasted no time letting the heat of the evidence cool. The moment he finished watching, he sent the clip to every member of the city council. No explanation, no caption, just the raw file, letting the images and sounds speak for themselves. When he hit send, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled a long breath, not in relief, but in acknowledgement that this was only the opening shot of a much larger battle. Less than an hour later, his desk phone rang. On the other end was the council secretary's voice, urgent but measured. "We need to talk now." The tone carried none of the formality of a routine meeting. It was the signal that the wall of protection had begun to crack. And Marcus, his eyes still imprinted with the images from that 8-year-old body cam, knew he had just found the detonator to bring it down completely. The words, "We need to talk now," from the council secretary, were still echoing in Marcus's head. When the next day's sun reached the top of the central square, the rain-polished stone plaza gleamed, reflecting the shadows of people gathering into a vast circle. A temporary stage had been erected, the microphones sound-checked 3 times, and dozens of television lenses were fixed on a podium, draped in a thin red carpet. The atmosphere was like an inauguration, but the tense faces revealed that today was a public execution of power. Marcus stepped out from behind the curtain, his suit pressed to a sharp line, a deep blue tie pinned neatly beneath the collar of his white shirt. His steps were steady and firm, neither rushed nor hesitant, each one landing like a nail driven into the square, fastening the crowd's gaze to him. When he stopped before the microphone, the murmur of voices dropped to the sound of breath alone. His voice carried unshaken, without the need to shout, yet strong enough for even the last row to catch every word. "I am here today," he began, "to make it clear that the images and sounds you have seen are not an incident. They are evidence." A wave of silence pressed forward as he paused half a second, then continued. "Evidence demands action." Marcus turned toward the long table on the right of the stage where shouter and pusher stood, uniforms crisp, but their eyes stripped of the confidence they once wore. He called each name aloud, his tone low but hard like a gavel strike in a courtroom. "Officer Daniel Shouter, Officer Mark Pusher, by the authority of the mayor, I am suspending you from duty effective immediately." A security officer stepped forward holding a wooden tray, and in front of the live broadcast cameras, Marcus ordered, "Surrender your weapons and badges." The metallic clink of a sidearm hitting the tray rang harshly through the dead silence, followed by the snap of a badge pin being pulled from a chest. Shouter pressed his lips tight, holding the metal a second longer before releasing it, while Pusher kept his head down, moving quickly as if to escape the moment as soon as possible. Marcus looked straight into the cameras, enunciating every word. "Badges are not shields for your crime." The statement drilled through the shell of excuses, striking the core of those who had believed the badge to be an unassailable wall. Then, as if on cue, the entire square erupted with the chant of "You." The sound crashed against the facades of surrounding buildings, splintering into 100 echoes that swirled around the stage. In that roar, the two officers bowed their heads, not in humility, but because there was no way to lift them under the gaze of millions watching. The camera zoomed in, catching the line of sweat rolling down Shouter's cheek, and the hollow look in Pusher's eyes, as though he could already see the verdict yet to be spoken. As the press conference seemed to be drawing to a close, a front-row journalist raised her hand, not waiting to be called on before asking outright, "Is this just the beginning?" Marcus turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly, the corner of his mouth curling into a thin smile, offering no reply. That silence under the midday sun spoke more than any words could. That afternoon, City Hall was awash in light, pouring through the tall glass windows, spilling across the long table where the council members, the city attorney, and representatives from the security bureau filled every seat. In front of each person was a standby monitor, and in the center of the table, Marcus set down a portable hard drive, its glossy black casing reflecting the overhead light. Without a lengthy preamble, he connected the drive to the projection system. With a single click, the wall behind him lit up, revealing an enormous data table. Hundreds of white lines on a black background, each one a citizen's name and the date they were arrested. This was no commemorative roll call or harmless administrative record. It was a map of wrongful arrests, stretching across years, preserved in the police department's classified database. The eyes of the council members, all locked onto the screen at once, as if pulled by gravity. Shouter, seated several rows from the display, leaned forward. At first he tried to hold himself in a posture of calm, but as his gaze swept quickly down the list, his pupils widened. His name appeared first on line 12, then again at line 16, then at line 23. By the time the count passed 30, the hand resting on the table had curled in on itself, the knuckles blanching white. Beside him, Pusher didn't linger on the screen for long. He bowed his head, his lips moving faintly, almost only for himself to hear. "We're done." The whisper wasn't a question. It was an unconscious confession. Marcus turned back, not toward the two men, but to face the full council. His voice carried not loud but heavy. "This is rot from the top." The words didn't just name a cluster of individuals. They drove a stake into the very heart of a system that prided itself on being the pillar of justice. When he scrolled to the bottom of the list, several entries stood out in red letters. "Classified." The security advisors instantly rose from their seats, exchanging taut glances. The presence of top-secret records inside this leaked data set meant they had been deliberately buried, kept from the light for reasons no one wanted exposed. Marcus stopped at the final line, not rushing to reveal it. He turned, letting his gaze sweep across the entire room, making each person feel as though they had just been called by name without yet hearing their sentence. His hand lifted, pointing to that last entry, his voice dropping lower. And this one changes everything. The air thickened at once, and for a moment every breath in the room seemed to pause, waiting for the door to a new political explosion to be thrown open. Under the relentless glare of the cameras, with the restless murmur of the crowd swelling and ebbing like an incoming tide, Marcus rose from his seat as if gravity itself deferred to him. His shadow stretched long across the polished wood of the hearing table, cutting between the two officers seated opposite him. The air was taut, electric, every lens hungry for the first word. He did not pace, did not fidget. He placed both hands on the table, eyes sweeping over the assembled officials, then the public beyond, before locking on Shouter and Pusher with an unwavering steadiness that felt like a verdict already delivered. His voice, when it came, was calm, but sharp enough to draw blood. "I will read the names of the innocent before I read the names of those with badges," he said, and the sentence sliced through the space with the cold precision of a guillotine blade. A ripple moved through the audience, an almost imperceptible shift in posture, as if everyone understood that the ground beneath them had just tilted. Shouter jolted to his feet, chair legs screeching in protest against the floor, his voice snapping out with a mixture of rage and desperate bravado. "You don't get to." The words were cut clean in half by the sound of Marcus's gavel striking wood. One measured strike, then another and another. He didn't look at Shouter when he spoke, his gaze fixed forward, his tone carved from marble. "Sit down. You do not give order." The command was not barked. It was bestowed, icy, deliberate and heavy with the authority of a man who knew the law could be both scalpel and hammer. Pusher, still seated, tried to mask his unease with a smirk, lips twisting into something meant to convey disdain, but collapsing under the weight of his nerves. His fingers betrayed him, clawing into the edge of the table until the knuckles widened and the nails left faint crescents in the varnish. He leaned back slightly as if distance could dilute the inevitability of what was coming, but his eyes kept darting to the stack of documents in front of Marcus, like a man watching a countdown he couldn't stop. Marcus reached into the folder before him and withdrew a single photograph. It was placed with deliberate care on the table, then lifted for all to see. The close-up image of metal handcuffs locked around his wrists, the polished surface of the mayor's ID card visible in the same frame. The lighting in the photograph was stark, the juxtaposition undeniable, status and subjugation occupying the same square of reality. He turned it toward the cameras. "This," Marcus said, his tone even but resonant, "is the emblem of impotence that arises when power forgets to verify." The words landed with the weight of an anvil. There was no flourish, no dramatic pause, just the crisp efficiency of a judge stamping a sentence into permanence. Shouter shifted uncomfortably, his earlier outburst now hanging in the air like a bad odor he couldn't wave away. Pusher's smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by a fixed stare at the table, as though studying the grain might shield him from the truth. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping in volume, but hardening in tone, each syllable deliberate, measured and lethal. "If I were not the mayor," he asked, eyes boring into theirs, "what would you have written in your report today?" The silence that followed was cavernous. No one moved. Even the cameras seemed to hold still, lenses frozen as if afraid to break the spell. Shouter's mouth opened and closed once, twice, the sound never making it past his teeth. Pusher shifted in his seat, but the only noise he produced was the faint scrape of his shoe against the floor. Marcus let the quiet expand, letting it weigh on them, letting it crush the thin armor of denial that clung to their faces. The crowd was a sea of held breaths, the kind of silence that wasn't absence of sound, but presence of judgment. Finally, without raising his voice, Marcus reached for a thick sealed envelope lying at the edge of the table. His fingers tore through the flap with a single, unhurried motion, the rip of paper magnified in the stillness. He lifted the contents slightly, just enough to hint at what lay within, and his gaze swept the room one last time. "And here," he said, his voice like a lock clicking open in a darkened cell, "is the part that was never aired 8 years ago." The words did not explode. They detonated slowly, their impact sinking in with a cold inevitability that promised the next moment would not be forgotten by anyone in the room, or by anyone watching from beyond the glass lens and the world screamed. The room had not yet exhaled from the weight of the last revelation, when Marcus moved again, as if the previous blow had only been the first crack in a dam about to burst. He did not raise his voice, yet the shift in his posture drew every eye back to him with an almost gravitational pull. The envelope from before lay closed now, but in its place a thick binder rested beneath his hands. The light caught the polished edge of the metal rings as he opened it, revealing two sheets side by side, identical in form, but not in truth. He slid them under the projection camera, the images blooming across the massive screen behind him. Every stroke of ink enlarged until it felt like the handwriting itself could be interrogated. Two versions, Marcus began, his tone stripped of anything but precision. Same incident report, same date, same officer signature. He lifted a finger, tapping one corner where Pusher's name lay in black script. This one was filed before Officer Pusher's medical leave. And this one, his finger slid to the second version. The same signature replicated perfectly down to the slant of the final letter, was filed during that leave in a case where no lawful officer should have been holding a pen on city time. The words were clinical, but the implication bled into the air like a spreading stain. Pusher's jaw flexed, his eyes narrowing as if sheer force of will could project dissolve. "It's nothing unusual," he muttered, forcing the words through clenched teeth, the corners of his mouth twitching into the ghost of a smirk. "It happens in every department. You keep the machine running." From the other side, Chowder leaned forward, his tone a venomous hiss. "Everyone does it," he spat, each syllable loaded with defiance. "Don't act like it's some grand revelation. You're just dressing it up to—" Marcus cut him clean. "No," he said, the word a flat blade, sharp and final. "Only those afraid of the truth do this. Only those who think accountability is a luxury, not a duty." The silence after was taut enough to snap. He reached into the binder again, sliding out a page marked in red. The line he wanted was already waiting for him, underlined with an almost surgical strike of ink. "No ID check performed." The phrase repeated again and again across multiple entries, each recurrence like a hammer driving the same nail deeper into the coffin of their defense. "You see this line?" Marcus asked, holding it high enough for the cameras to capture. "It appears not once, not twice, but dozens of times under your names. This is not an oversight, it is a pattern. And patterns are the bones of corruption. They hold the shape of it long after the excuses have rotted away." Somewhere in the crowd, a voice from memory resurfaced, sharp and clear, as Marcus's mind replayed the words of a former officer who had once sat across from him in a quiet, unrecorded meeting. "I warned them. I told them what was happening. They told me to shut my mouth." That voice had not trembled then, and it did not tremble now in the echo of recollection. It was the voice of someone who had watched rot take root and had been silenced before they could cut it out. Pusher's gaze flicked to the cameras, a reflex born from years of knowing when to perform and when to hide. He straightened in his chair, drew in a breath, and spoke with the careful measure of a man trying to recast his history. "We only wanted safety," he said, the tone almost plaintive, almost reasonable, but his eyes gave him away, darting, restless, unwilling to land anywhere for more than a heartbeat. Marcus didn't lean forward. He didn't need to. "Safety," he said, letting the word hang for a moment before he finished it, with the precision of a marksman. "For whom?" The question didn't just cut. It reached inside, dragged the assumption into the light, and left it there to shrivel under the gaze of the public. Pusher blinked, but no answer came. Marcus let the silence linger, then reached into his jacket pocket. When his hand emerged, it held a small black USB drive, no bigger than a thumb. Yet, in that moment, it felt like it carried the weight of the city itself. He held it between two fingers, not high, but just enough for the nearest camera to focus. "On here," he said, his voice low but resonant, "is body cam footage from the night of June 17th, 8 years ago, and the sound of a child's scream." The last word didn't rise. It sank, pulling the air in the room down with it, leaving nothing in its wake but the quiet terror of what was about to come. The USB drive slid into the port with a soft click, a sound so slight it was almost swallowed by the hush in the chamber. Marcus stepped back, allowing the screen behind him to come alive, its surface blooming from black into a grainy, flickering frame. The footage was raw, unsteady, the jitter of movement, pulling the viewer into the scene with the disorienting immediacy of lived fear. A narrow street shimmered faintly under the dull glow of a lamppost, the lens swaying as if the very air were trembling. And then came the sharp, uneven sound of a child's breathing, fast and shallow, each gasp dragging across the speakers like the rasp of a saw. "Dumb, I was just asking for directions," the boy's voice pleaded, the words frayed and trembling, but still intact, still defiant in their innocence. His tone carried no aggression, no threat, only the desperate need to be understood. The audio caught the crunch of shoes on asphalt, heavy and fast, closing in. Shouter's voice tore through the speakers like a whip crack. "Get down." The order was not a command, but an attack hurled with the full weight of a man accustomed to instant submission. The camera jolted violently as a boot swung into frame, the motion too sudden to process, until it connected not with the lens, but with the boy. The impact landed off-screen, yet its force was visible in the abrupt skid of the camera's perspective. The sound of flesh and pavement colliding, and then the stark smear of red across the dark street. The blood's glint under the lamplight was sharp, cold, and far too bright against the black. From the periphery, Pusher's voice came low but cut in the beam of his flashlight, lancing into the boy's eyes. The light burned through the grain of the footage, erasing detail in a white glare that made the boy's blinking, reddened eyes all the more brutal. His lips pressed tight until the skin split, a bead of blood catching in the corner as he bit down hard, swallowing whatever sound he might have made. The image wavered as the boy's head tilted away from the glare, but the flashlight followed, merciless, unblinking. Marcus did not speak. His silence was deliberate, letting the images bear their indictment. He stepped to the console, fingers dancing over the controls, and with a slow, precise gesture, he rotated the frame. The picture shifted, and there it was, the smear of blood, no longer just a blur on the pavement, but now running in a straight, damning line to the edge of a black leather shoe. The enlargement tightened until the detail filled the screen. The blood's texture, the curve of the shoe's stitching, the worn crease at the toe, and above it, faint but undeniable, the insignia etched into the side, Officer Shouter's mark. The room's silence had deepened into something heavier, denser, like the pressure before a storm. Even Shouter's breath, usually a constant undercurrent of restless irritation, seemed to have been stolen from him. Pusher stared rigidly at the table, his knuckles taut against the wood, the skin along his neck flushed and damp. The footage rolled on for a moment longer, the boy's uneven breathing filling the space, then cut abruptly to black. Marcus's voice when it came was steady, like the rough edge of iron. 15 seconds of silence, he said. For that child, he did not need to raise a hand for compliance. The chamber obeyed. No coughs, no shuffling, no whispers, just the collective stillness of people who could not decide whether to lower their eyes or hold them open and face what they had seen. Time thickened, each second of quiet stretching, pressing against the edges of the room until it felt as though even the walls were listening. When the 15th second passed, Marcus leaned slightly forward, his gaze sweeping once more over the officers before settling somewhere beyond them, toward the doors at the rear of the chamber. His voice dropped softer now, but no less weighted. "That child," he said, "is grown now, and standing just outside this room." The words hung in the air, not as a threat, but as an inevitability, the kind that bends the shape of the moment and forces everyone within it to reckon with what comes next. The chamber doors opened without fanfare, yet the shift in the air was immediate, as if an unseen tide had turned and drawn every gaze toward the threshold. A man stepped inside, not hurried, not hesitant, but with a measured calm that absorbed the room's attention in a single motion. He carried no paper, no prepared statement, no visible armor beyond the set of his shoulders and the unwavering steadiness of his eyes. Time had given him height, build, and the poise of someone who had endured storms without bowing. But the grain of memory in his face was unmistakable. For the first time since the footage had played, Shouter and Pusher both looked at him. And for the first time, they did not look away because they wanted to. They looked away because they had to. He stopped halfway down the aisle, in perfect alignment with the officer's table. And for a moment, he simply stood there, letting the weight of recognition settle into every crevice of the silence. When he spoke, his voice was not raised. It did not need to be. The 4 sentences he delivered were carved with precision, each one landing like the chambering of a round. "You can't scare me anymore." The words didn't tremble. They cut. The calm in his tone made them sharper, the kind of calm that comes from walking through fire and realizing You will not burn again. Shouter shifted in his seat, the leather creaking faintly under him. His eyes flicked upward, but when they met the man's gaze they faltered, dropping just enough to betray the fracture. His voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. I don't remember clearly. The sentence stumbled over itself, the once brash officer sounding like a man picking his way through broken glass. Marcus didn't give the silence room to breed excuses. The body cam remembers for you, he said, his voice cutting through the gap with the clean finality of a verdict. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. The implication was ironclad. Memory could be selective, but evidence was eternal. Pusher, still leaning back in his chair, allowed a curl of sarcasm to twist across his mouth, as if sheer mockery might dissolve the gravity pressing down on him. That kid was provoking us, he said, tossing the words into the air with the casual malice of someone who believed cruelty could still hold its ground. The man's reply was instant, flat, and lethal in its simplicity. I asked for the address of a church. No embellishment, no elaboration, just the truth, clean and unadorned. And in that absence of rhetoric, the weight of it multiplied. The space between those words and the officer's silence was more damning than any shouted accusation could have been. Marcus rose slightly from his chair, stepping toward the witness. He placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder, not in comfort, not in sympathy, but in recognition. Justice doesn't need to shout, he said, his voice pitched low enough that it was clear the sentence was meant for everyone in the room. It only needs to stand straight for a moment. No one moved. Then, as if cued by something deeper than applause, a sparse, heavy clap began somewhere in the back, joined by another and another, until the sound filled the chamber, not thunderous, but deliberate. Each strike of palm against palm, like the measured fall of an axe into seasoned wood. It wasn't a celebration. It was an acknowledgement. Marcus inclined his head once, then stepped back toward his seat. As the sound faded, his chief advisor leaned in, speaking with a voice meant only for him. The classified file, the advisor murmured, is open. Marcus did not look surprised. He only straightened in his chair as though the news had confirmed a trajectory he had already seen, mapped out in his mind. The words from his advisor still lingered in the air when Marcus reached for the thick, locked folder that had been waiting at the edge of the table like a sealed chamber of judgment. He placed it before him, the sound of the clasp releasing loud enough to ripple through the quiet. Inside lay the kind of truth that corrodes from the inside out, a compiled record buried so deep that even whispers of its existence had been treated as fiction. With deliberate care, Marcus drew out the final page and slid it beneath the projection lens. The screen behind him flared to life, its glow casting every face in stark relief. Rows of names appeared, each accompanied by dates, charges, and the single damning notation, detained in error. The list was long, but Marcus's finger did not wander. It moved with purpose, tracing down the column until it stopped at the bottom. The last line was underlined in red. This, Marcus said, his voice stripped of any ornament, is the one they never wanted you to see. His thumb tapped the notation, and with a flick of the remote, the audio file linked to it began to play. The chamber was filled with the raspy, deliberate tone of a voice steeped in authority. Don't let the city go soft over a few tears. The words were not hurried. They were spoken with the slow certainty of someone who believed their cruelty was wisdom, that their will was the law. The recognition hit like a crack of thunder. Every head turned, every set of eyes drawn toward the two officers who had once stood so sure of themselves. Marcus's own hands pressed flat against the table, the tendons tightening as he leaned forward. Weakness, he said, his tone steady yet edged with steel, is letting the wicked walk free. Shouter's mask fractured first. His voice burst out louder than the walls deserved, a mix of rage and surrender. He ordered it. The outcry carried the brittle edge of a man whose shield had been ripped away, whose only defense now was to point at the hand that had once fed him. Marcus's reply was immediate, cutting clean through the noise. An unlawful order is a crime, not a shield. He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. The weight came not from volume but from the unflinching certainty behind the word. Shouter's shoulders collapsed slightly, the fight in his eyes dimming into something closer to panic. Pusher's turn came slower. His voice was lower, almost muttered, as though hoping the microphones might not catch it. We followed the standard protocol for risk prevention. It was an attempt at rationalization, a final thread of bureaucracy to cling to in a room where the air had turned against him. Marcus's hand moved without hesitation. The gavel struck the wood once, sharp as a pistol crack. The only standard, he said, locking eyes with both men in turn, is the Constitution. The echo of the gavel seemed to hang in the air longer than sound should, stretching the silence into something palpable. He straightened, the authority in his posture leaving no room for misinterpretation. This chamber will convene tonight, he announced, to hold a vote of no confidence in the current chief of police. There was no build-up, no pause for effect. The decision was not up for debate. It had already been rendered. The words fell like the closing of a vault door, sealing the fate of another name, soon to join the list on the screen. The announcement of the vote had barely finished echoing through the chamber when the city's great square began to transform. Under the sharp glare of floodlights and the unblinking eyes of cameras, a platform had been erected at its center, flanked by the banners of the city and the seal of its council. The crowd pressed in from all sides, citizens, reporters, officials and officers alike, each drawn by the promise of something rare. Power being stripped bare in the open air. The winter wind curled through the square, sharp against the skin, but no one moved to leave. The tension was a living thing coiled around the base of the platform and waiting to be loosed. Marcus stood at the podium, the notes in front of him arranged with a precision that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with the gravity of what he was about to say. His gaze swept the audience, pausing briefly on the front row, where the chief of police sat with an expression balanced between disdain and defiance. Behind the chief, shouter and pusher sat in silence, their bodies rigid as though bracing against a storm that had already begun to break. The microphones hissed faintly before settling into clarity. Marcus's voice emerged even and unwavering. "For every badge there is a duty," he began, "and for every betrayal of that duty, there must be a reckoning." He picked up the first sheet from the stack before him. "Reason 1, he said, reading aloud the charge before speaking the name attached to it. The crowd reacted not with jeers, but with the low rumbling agreement of people who had waited too long to hear their history spoken aloud. The rhythm took shape. Each reason was followed by a name. Each name was followed by silence. Then the faint, heavy sound of murmured acknowledgments spreading through the crowd. Marcus did not rush. He allowed each charge to hang for a heartbeat before delivering the next, as if each was a brick being laid into the structure of an unassailable case. By the fifth reason, the chief's posture had stiffened further, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. When the final page was set aside, the chief rose to speak, his voice sharp and deliberate. "This city needs iron discipline," he declared, projecting to the farthest reaches of the square. "Without it, chaos takes root. Without it, the people you claim to protect will be the ones who suffer." Marcus did not turn away, nor did he step back. "Discipline," he replied, "does not require silence. It does not require fear, and it does not require the erasure of truth to function." His words were not a rebuttal. They were a dismantling, brick by brick, of the chief's claim to moral ground. From his seat, Shouter's gaze locked on his former mentor. The older man's nameplate was being unscrewed from the table before him by a clerk, the metallic screech ringing out like the sound of a chain being broken. Shouter's expression hardened into something unreadable, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the shift. This was no longer the figure who had shaped him. It was simply another man being undone. Beside him, Pusher's composure was beginning to fray. Beads of sweat caught the light at his temple, his fingers clenching and unclenching on his knees, as though trying to grip something that was no longer there. He seemed to see in the slow removal of that nameplate the breaking of links in a chain that had bound them all, one link after another, snapping until there was nothing left to hold. Marcus lifted the gavel, its polished head catching the light in a brief flash. One strike, and the sound cracked across the square like a rifle shot. A second strike followed, heavier, the vibrations running through the podium into the air. The third strike came slower, deeper, and the microphone caught the sharp feedback of its echo, a long drawn-out wail that hung above the crowd like the last breath of an era that had finally collapsed under its weight. For a moment the square was still, holding the sound in the space between breaths. Then Marcus stepped back from the podium, as aides moved forward to escort the chief away. His title stripped, his authority dissolved in the glare of public record. It was then, as the murmur of the crowd swelled again, that an aide approached Marcus from the side, leaning in just enough for the words to reach only him. "The district attorney's office has approved prosecution," the aide whispered. Shouter and push. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, not in surprise but in the quiet acknowledgement of inevitability. The square, the cameras, the people, they had all witnessed the fall of one pillar. Soon two more would follow. The news from the district attorney's office spread through the square like the tightening of an invisible noose, unseen, yet felt in every shift of breath, in the way conversations clipped themselves short, in the instinctive glances toward the stage, as though some unspoken signal had been given. The chief was gone, his absence not a relief but a vacuum, and the space he left behind was instantly overshadowed by the sharper, more immediate gravity of what came next. Marcus stepped forward again, not in haste, but with the kind of measured certainty that pulled the restless hum into stillness. Even the wind seemed to still its movement through the plaza, holding back so that the next words could fall without distraction. His voice, when it came, was anchored in the unshakable weight of a verdict already decided, the timbre of someone who knew the crowd would remember every syllable. An indictment has been approved, he said, letting each word land like a deliberate strike on stone. The phrase itself was enough to make the front row shift. There was a woman in a burgundy scarf, the same one who had stood outside a council member's fundraiser months earlier, with a placard listing the names of those wrongfully detained, her image frozen in photographs that spread before the speeches inside had even begun. Behind her sat a man whose quiet defiance had been immortalized in a 10-second clip, him holding the door of his store shut, while one of the defendants pounded on it, demanding entry, the caption reading simply, "Not welcome here." Both now watched Marcus with the still intensity of people who had been waiting for this moment far longer than anyone on the stage. Before the next day begins, Marcus continued, both of you will face the charges you have earned. There was no inflection unearned beyond its inherent gravity, yet it settled in the air like a weight no one could pretend not to feel. Near the fountain, a student journalist studied her camera, her lens trained on the defendants, just as it had been the night she projected arrest statistics across the stone facade of the precinct, the numbers glowing in cold, unflinching white for all to see. The faint mechanical whir of her zoom was almost lost in the hush. "But I will make this plain," Marcus said, his gaze sweeping over them, unblinking. "Anyone who confesses now will still face justice, yet that confession will be part of the record." On the far edge of the crowd, a retired bus driver tightened his grip on the wooden cane he leaned against. He had once been filmed standing in the path of a ceremonial parade float, carrying both defendants, refusing to move until they stepped down, the footage replayed on evening broadcasts for days. That same unmovable expression was on his face now. "I will not intervene in the case," Marcus went on, each word falling in the kind of steady rhythm that stripped away any illusion of bargaining, "but the truth will be written beside your name." The crowd did not murmur or shift this time. They simply absorbed it, the kind of absorption that burrows deep and waits to resurface later, sharper than before. In the front row, a young woman who had once live-streamed her confrontation with one of the defendants, her voice unshaken even as he tried to shout her down, held her phone low, not recording, just listening. Marcus's final sentence came without the rise or fall of rhetoric, but it cut sharper than anything that had come before. "That is the only choice you have left." The offer was not compassion, it was a controlled detonation placed with precision, where it would do the most damage. Pusher's eyes darted to Shouter, then to the crowd, then down to his own trembling hands, as though the truth might somehow be hiding there in the lines of his palms. The light from the overhead fixtures seemed harsher on him than on anyone else, revealing every flicker of movement, every twitch of muscle he couldn't control. His breathing had quickened, uneven, the rise and fall of his chest, disjointed, his shoulders twitching with the effort of holding still. The tension in him wasn't just visible, it was audible. The shallow hitch in his breath, almost catching the microphone in a faint, static-laced whisper. Across the gallery, a woman in a slate gray coat leaned forward in her seat. The same woman whose face had been seen across millions of phone screens after she stood in the doorway of her cafe and refused entry to one of Pusher's patrol partners. Her quiet, "Not here," immortalized in a 10-second clip, replayed until it became part of the city's lexicon. 2 rows behind her, a man sat with his hands folded, His image already burned into the public's memory from the winter protest, where he walked directly up to Pusher, placed a folded legal document in his palm, and then stepped back without a word, the cameras drinking in the way Pusher's fingers tightened around it, as if it might burn. Near the aisle, a teenager held her phone steady, her live stream catching the beads of sweat forming at Pusher's hairline. She was the same one who had once projected arrest records onto the precinct wall, her defiance glowing in white light that climbed higher than any ladder could reach. Behind her, a teacher sat stiff back, her voice still remembered from the day she read aloud the names of those wrongfully detained, the recording echoing through the marble of City Hall, while Pusher kept his head down at the defense table. All of them were here now, and their presence pressed in on him as tangibly as the air itself. The silence between his breaths was not forgiving. It was dense, a vacuum that seemed to draw the words out of him, whether he wanted to speak them or not. He looked briefly at Chowder, whose expression had calcified into something between disbelief and contempt, but found nothing there to cling to. His gaze returned to the table before him, fingers curling slightly as though to grip the wood, though his hands never made contact. When he finally spoke, the sound was unsteady, the edges of his words jagged as if they had been chipped away from somewhere deep inside. He paused, the syllable hanging weightless, yet crushing in the thick air. I altered the report. The confession cut into the space like a shard of glass, irregular and sharp, and for a moment, even the faint hum of the lights seemed to recede. A rustle went through the back row, someone shifting, another exhaling sharply, the small sounds amplified by the stillness that swallowed them. Pusher's mouth opened again, his lips dragging over each word as though they resisted forming. I changed the timestamps, he said, his tone flattening, not from detachment, but from the exhaustion of holding the truth back for so long. The words seemed to fall heavily onto the record, joining the chain of evidence that had already wrapped around him. He drew one shallow breath, then forced out the rest, his voice faltering as it met the final admission. Removed the lines about, no ID. His voice cracked once on the last phrase, but he didn't stop, as though the act of speaking had turned into a grim necessity. Chowder's head snapped toward him, the movement sharp enough to send a brief ripple through the room, disbelief and fury flaring in equal measure. His lips pulled back just enough to bare his teeth, before the word struck. You spineless. He stopped himself mid-syllable as though the insult lost its shape halfway out, his glare cutting back to Marcus, with the precision of a thrown blade. The pause was only a breath, and then his voice rose in a whip crack that slashed the stillness in two. You hypocrite. You're using your office to crucify us while you parade yourself as the savior of this city. The venom in his tone carried the brittle pitch of a man throwing every last weapon in reach, hoping one might still cut deep. It was meant to wound, to claw back ground he had already lost, but it landed like a desperate shot fired too late, ricocheting off the unshaken air between them. In the gallery, a woman in a burgundy coat shifted in her seat, the same woman who had gone viral months earlier after standing on her shop's doorstep and refused entry to a uniformed officer tied to Chowder's cases. Her single word, no, captured by a passing journalist and shared across the city before the day ended. 2 seats over, a retired bus driver fixed Chowder with an unblinking stare. He had once stood in the street during a parade, blocking a municipal float Chowder rode on, the footage showing him holding his ground as the music and celebration faltered around him. Toward the back, a young man adjusted the strap of his camera, his lens having caught the moment a commissioner's face froze in shock when arrest statistics were projected across the front of precinct headquarters. That light had burned through the night and into every morning newscast. All of them now watched without moving, the same steady focus that had followed Chowder from the day his first denial cracked in public. Marcus didn't flinch. His reply came immediately, as if the words had been waiting in place all along. They carried no heat, no theatrical edge, but they were forged from iron. I use my office, he said, his gaze locked on Chowder, to remove those who use their badge to harm the people they swore to protect. The quiet in his delivery gave the words a gravitational pull, each syllable an unanswerable truth that did not need to be raised above the crowd to be heard. From the far right bench, a man in a navy scarf shifted forward slightly,
known for walking into a winter protest with a wrongful arrest report in hand and placing it directly into a commander's grasp. While the news cameras rolled, his presence here, like the others, was a reminder that the room held more than spectators. It held living footnotes to the defendant's history. At the defense table, Pusher's lawyer was already moving, his steps quick but measured as he threaded through the side aisle, the hem of his coat brushing the knees of those seated along the way. In his hands, a single folded document that seemed to absorb the light, rather than reflect it. He reached the clerk and placed it down without flourish, the gesture final in its economy. The clerk's eyes flicked to the top page. There it was, the preliminary admission of guilt, signed and time-stamped, the ink dark enough to suggest it had dried only moments before. In the second row, a woman who had once read a list of wrongful detentions aloud in front of City Hall during rush hour, now leaned back slightly, her gaze dropped into the paper as if she could see its contents through the distance. At the edge of the prosecution's table, a junior attorney glanced up from her notes, the corner of her mouth tightening, not in satisfaction, but in recognition that the arc of the case had just crossed its irreversible point. The lawyer's voice when it came was low but firm, carrying only to those who needed to hear it. We submit this in the interest of leniency. It was less a plea than an acknowledgement that the tide could not be turned. Marcus turned his face toward the nearest camera, the lens capturing every line, every deliberate stillness in his expression. The floodlights bleached the stage into a stark arena where shadows clung only to the edges, leaving nothing to hide behind. His voice carried with the even weight of someone speaking not only to the square before him, but to every living room, every phone screen, every diner television tuned to the broadcast. Tomorrow, he said, the syllables clean and unbroken, this city will no longer endure what it has been forced to endure. That chapter ends tonight. The words did not rise into applause. Instead, they settled low and heavy, absorbed into the crowd's quiet, as though the weight of them required a pause before the next breath. Somewhere in the front rows, a man in a thick wool coat leaned forward, the same man whose face had been captured months earlier, confronting a council member outside her fundraiser, his hand, holding a printout of eviction records, steady against her chest until she looked down in shame. 2 seats over, a woman whose viral footage had first drawn the city's attention, her phone trembling as it recorded the moment a store owner refused service to a uniformed officer, watched Marcus, without blinking, her lips pressed into a line that was neither approval nor doubt, only witness. Toward the back, a college student shifted the strap of her camera bag, her lens having once caught the frozen, startled look of a commissioner, when arrest statistics were projected in glowing white across the precinct facade. Each of them carried a fragment of the same ledger that now hung over this platform like weather. The words had barely settled when the sound of scraping wood tore through the quiet, sharp enough to slice the stillness into. Shouter's chair shot backward, its legs shrieking across the platform with a grating protest that reverberated through the sound system. The movement was not calculated. It was a reflex born of something breaking open inside him. His face emerged from the half-shadow as a mask of rage, the skin flushed, the veins in his temples drawn tight. His eyes were red-veined and wild, darting once toward the crowd as though searching for a single ally and finding none. From the far edge of the square, a man in a navy scarf lifted his phone, streaming the moment, just as he had streamed the winter protest, where he walked a wrongful arrest report straight into the hands of its signer. Shouter's voice erupted, cracking under the strain into a stream of curses, the kind that even the most forgiving microphone could not smooth. It was the sound of a man trying to reclaim the authority that had been stripped from him, each word flung outward and landing flat against the wall of silence that met him. He reached for the chair with a suddenness that made the nearest officer shift his weight, and in the same motion, he hurled it sideways. The crash rang out over the speakers in a metallic howl, bouncing off the stone facades of the surrounding building, the kind of sound that would replay as much for its violence as for its futility. Somewhere, near the fountain, a woman in a black coat, known for standing in front of the courthouse months ago with a stack of printed names, reading each one into a live microphone until the list was finished, watched without moving, her gaze steady on the unfolding collapse. 2 officers moved in instantly, their approach swift but controlled, hands seizing his arms with practiced precision. The glint of cuffs caught the floodlight as they locked into place, the flash of steel punctuating the moment in the language of finality. From the press row, lenses adjusted in near-perfect sync, reporters murmuring brief cues to their crew. The camera operators swiveled in perfect unison, zooming tight until the frame was filled with Shouter's face, flushed, teeth bared, eyes burning with the last embers of a fire that had already gone out. The crash of the chairs still echoed in memory when the courthouse doors opened to the public, a sound recalled by more than those who had been in the room that day. It had replayed online in clipped looping videos the moment a once confident official confronted in a televised hearing had risen too abruptly, his chair toppling behind him like the punctuation of a failed argument. That echo seemed to travel with the crowd now entering, their steps measured against the marble floor, their coats brushing in the hush. The trial had been set with unusual swiftness, the urgency sharpened by the weight of evidence that no delay could dilute, and by the knowledge that the city's patience had already been stretched to its breaking point. Inside the courtroom was a fortress of formality, polished wood that held the sheen of decades, brass fixtures reflecting fractured shards of light, and the unyielding gaze of the city seal mounted high above the bench like a watchman immune to sentiment. Rows of citizens filled the gallery, each seat occupied with intent. They were not mere spectators but witnesses, the closing act of a long brutal play unfolding in the same space where verdicts had once been bent by influence. In the front row sat a woman whose face had become a fixture in news cycles months earlier, after she stood outside her shuttered store and read aloud the charges that had closed it, her voice steady even as the wind lifted the edges of the eviction notice in her hand. 2 seats down, a retired bus driver leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, the same posture he had taken the day he blocked the defendant from boarding a city parade float, a refusal caught on multiple cameras and broadcast before the event had even ended. Near the aisle, a teenager scrolled through her phone, with her thumb poised above the screen, replaying the clip she had taken the night the precinct wall lit up with projected arrest records. The glow of those numbers had reached the courthouse steps, etching the data into stone, and memory alive. Further back, an older man in a navy coat adjusted his scarf, the same man who during a winter protest had walked up to a former commissioner and handed him a copy of a wrongful arrest report in front of a live news crew, the paper trembling not from fear, but from the bite of the cold. These moments hovered like unspoken exhibits, threaded in the room together without a single word. At the defense table, the accused sat with expressions pulled tight, their hands either clasped too firmly or resting too still, betraying the kind of stillness that comes only when every gesture is measured for its consequence. The prosecution's table was orderly, papers stacked with deliberate symmetry, a laptop angled toward the bench, as if to remind the judge that everything here could be summoned on screen in seconds. The gallery's attention shifted as the bailiff entered, his voice low but carrying as he called the room to order. The judge emerged from the side door, robes settling around him like drawn curtains, and took his seat without glancing at the gallery. In the pause that followed, the soft scrape of a shoe against tile seemed too loud, the rustle of paper like wind in a bare room. It was the kind of silence that carried the memory of every name, every date, every moment that had brought them here, but held it all in a fragile balance, as if daring someone to be the one to break it. The air was taut, the kind of silence that could shatter under a single misstep. The prosecution wasted no time. A screen glowed to life beside the judge's bench, its cold light casting sharp edges on the faces. In the courtroom, the first frame displayed an unassuming spreadsheet. No photographs, no dramatics, just rows and columns, rendered in a font so plain it felt almost surgical. At a slight gesture from the prosecutor, the data began to fall in a clean, merciless order. Names, dates, and the unblinking column marked wrongful arrest. The list scrolled downward like a litany, each entry a measured strike, precise and undeniable. Hundreds of cases, the prosecutor said, his tone clipped, every syllable designed to cut without wasting breath, patterns too consistent to be an accident, too broad to be oversight. These are not mistakes, they are a method. The impact was both visual and auditory, with each new line that appeared. A faint metallic ping punctuated the moment, like nails dropping one by one into a steel pan, each sound flattening the air a little more. In the second row of the gallery, a shopkeeper sat forward, his elbows on his knees, remembering the day he had turned away a council member who once defended these same. The surveillance footage of him removing a menu from her hands and pointing to the door had traveled faster online than her official statements ever had. 3 seats down, a teacher whose quiet refusal to comply with an unlawful search order had been captured on a student's phone and replayed millions of times, sat unmoving, her eyes on the scrolling list as if measuring each name against a private inventory of memory. The prosecutor let the entries run without interruption, the deliberate pace, forcing the room to sit with each one. Near the aisle, a man in a dark coat shifted his weight, the same man who had once delivered an envelope of subpoenaed documents to a precinct commander in the middle of a public awards ceremony. The image of his hand extended, papers held steady, while cameras flashed, had become a permanent fixture in the city's digital archive of reckoning. As the names continued, the atmosphere thickened, the air holding the dull pressure of inevitability. In the far corner, a young woman leaned back in her chair, her face impassive, though she had been the one who had projected arrest statistics onto the precinct wall in the dead of night. The glow of her work, visible for blocks until morning, forced it into daylight. Every person in the room seemed tethered to the slow descent of that list, the rhythm of its unbroken order, impossible to escape. At the defense table, Pusher sat hunched, his shoulders rounded inward, as though trying to make himself smaller, to disappear into the shadow cast by the bench. His hands stayed clasped on the table, knuckles pale, his eyes fixed on some point below the rim of the screen. The scrolling finally stopped, the last name hanging there without ceremony, just another line in a column, but heavier than the hundreds before it. The judge turned his gaze toward the defense, the silence after the list as deliberate as the list itself. "Mr. Pusher," he said, his voice level. "Your response." For a moment, nothing came. The microphone waited, its thin stem bending slightly toward him, ready to catch even the smallest sound. When he finally spoke, his voice barely carried, raspy, thin, as though the air in his lungs resisted release. "I was wrong."
Fricting. He said the 3 words dry and coarse, reluctant in their exit, as though his own throat fought to hold them back. They did not absolve him. They only marked the point where his resistance finally dissolved. Shouter's turn came, and with it the last vestiges of defiance clung to him like a threadbare coat in a cold wind. He leaned into the microphone, shoulders squared as if bracing against an invisible push, his voice raised and brittle with anger. It was self-defense. The declaration shot out sharp and jagged, but before the echo had even faded from the paneled walls, the prosecutor raised a hand in a small, practiced signal to the technician at the side of the room. A faint click followed and the screen behind the bench flickered to life. The body cam footage rolled grainy, the frame jerking with movement, the muffled sound of breathing and boots on pavement. Yet even through the distortion, the sequence was clear and it told a different story entirely. There was no threat, no weapon, no sudden lunge that might justify the use of force. Only the steady, escalating aggression of the uniform against unarmed flesh. The camera catching the moment impact landed, the breath driven out of the victim's chest, the collapse that followed. The footage cut abruptly, the final frozen frame holding in the air like a held breath. Silence followed, so heavy it seemed to press against the walls, compressing the space between every person in the room. Somewhere near the back, a cough started and stopped in the same second, swallowed before it could echo. In the gallery's second row, a former precinct captain kept his eyes locked forward, perhaps remembering the night a live stream caught him being confronted by the mother of a boy whose case file he had signed. She had walked up to him at a fundraising dinner, her voice low but clear enough for the microphone nearby to catch every word. The footage watched millions of times before dawn. Near the aisle, a shop owner shifted in his seat. The same man who had once stood behind his counter, refusing to serve one of Shouter's allies when she entered with a camera crew. The clip of her leaving empty-handed, jaw tight, had been replayed endlessly with captions that needed no context. In the far corner, a teacher sat with folded arms, her face unreadable. She had been the one who months ago stepped into a city hall meeting, placed a stack of expulsion notices on the table, and read them aloud, not to accuse but to document, her calm delivery leaving those named with no space to hide. The room now seemed to carry the residue of all those moments, their weight folding into the silence left by the footage. From the witness section, Marcus rose. The motion was unhurried, as if the air itself made way for him. He walked to the stand without rush, without hesitation, his coat moving lightly at his sides, each step measured against the floor's muted echo. His presence alone drew every gaze, the way a shift in tide draws the eye even before the wave is visible. He placed one hand on the rail, his posture unbent, his expression steady as he turned toward the bench. When he spoke, his words came without ornament, each syllable cut clean. "If I were not the mayor," he said, his voice even, but edged with the gravity of lived truth, "I would have been a statistic." He let the weight of that settle for a heartbeat before finishing. A death was reported with the wrong cause, and the wrong name attached. He left it there, stepping down without another word, the restraint in his brevity cutting deeper than any speech could. The judge's hands folded over the papers before him, fingertips pressing into the stack just enough to keep them from shifting under the faint tremor of the ceiling fan. His tone was cool, not the coldness of indifference, but the precise measured cadence of law rendered in human voice, as if each syllable had been weighed before it was allowed to leave his mouth. On the charges presented, this court finds both defendants guilty. The air in the room seemed to contract with the words, shoulders tightening, breaths caught and released with quiet deliberation. He began to list the consequences with the precision of a chisel carving into stone: permanent revocation of badge and commission, custodial sentences aligned with the severity of the offenses, and monetary damages to be paid in civil restitution. There was no rush, no wasted motion in the delivery, each term landing without pause, the inevitability of justice taking its form before the crowd that filled every bench and leaned against the paneled walls. Near the back, a former district commander who had once defended the defendants in press conferences sat rigid, his jaw clenched as the memory of his own public unraveling seemed to resurface. The footage of him being escorted out of a civic gala after being denied entry by a security guard reading from a list, his name printed in bold, had looped online for days. The judge continued, his voice never straying from its path. In the gallery's front row, a man in a faded gray suit held himself still. The same man who months earlier had blocked a courthouse doorway with nothing but his cane, and the steadiness of his gaze when one of the defendants tried to slip inside to avoid cameras. The standoff had lasted minutes, but felt longer. The image immortalized in a photograph that now hung in the window of a neighborhood cafe. As the judge's list of terms neared its end, a murmur moved faintly through the observers, not in dissent, but in recognition. This was the conclusion they had been waiting for. 2 rows over, a young woman whose viral video had first exposed the misconduct sat with her arms folded, her eyes locked on the defendants without blinking. In her clip, she had stood on the sidewalk outside a precinct, phone raised, narrating the scene as one of them shoved a man into the back of a patrol car. The recording had spread beyond the city, stripping away the comfort of anonymity. The judge turned a page, the sound crisp against the stillness, then set it down and paused. He lifted his eyes to meet the room, scanning from one side to the other before speaking again. "And one more condition," he said, his voice tightening into something that felt almost personal, as if this part could not be cloaked in procedural neutrality. "You will deliver a public apology to the community you have wronged." He let the words settle for a moment before clarifying, each sentence clipped and deliberate, not in print, not in writing. A shift ran through the benches. Even those who had remained impassive leaned forward slightly. From the corner of the room, a reporter adjusted her camera, ready to capture whatever expression might break through the defendant's composure. In the row behind her, a shop owner who had once been targeted in a false report sat with his hands resting on his knee. The memory of the day he posted the surveillance footage online, a day that began with doubt and ended with a flood of support, still sharp in his mind. The judge did not look at him, but the moment carried an echo of that defiance in person. The words hung in the air, final and immovable, ensuring that the last act of their downfall would be performed under the same public gaze that had once watched them wield their authority unchecked. The verdict had been read, the sentences handed down, but the final condition, the one that would etch their downfall into the city's memory, remained hanging in the air like frost that refuses to melt even under noon light. The stage for it was nothing grand, nothing adorned. A bare platform stood in the center of the civic plaza, the same place where confetti had once rained down on election nights, and where chants had thundered during marches that shook the windows of the council hall. Now it was stripped to essential: a single microphone, a steel stand, and a wind that carried the sharp scent of winter through the gathered crowd. The cobblestones underfoot still bore faint stains from those earlier nights, spilled drinks, candle wax, and in one place near the eastern steps, a darker mark that no one had ever tried to scrub away. The air had a density to it, as if holding its breath. In the front row, an older woman stood unmoving, the same woman whose quiet refusal to hand over her shop's security footage years ago had forced a false report into the open. Her act had been caught on a street camera, and the clip, her hand resting firmly on the cash register, her lips saying no, had gone viral before she even locked up that night. A few paces away, a man in a navy coat shifted his weight, the fabric brushing against the crumpled copy of a subpoena that had once arrived at his office, unannounced, delivered by the same clerk he'd humiliated in a public meeting. The video of that delivery, captured by a passerby with a phone, had been replayed with relish in every corner of the city. Toward the back, a younger man leaned against the railing, his eyes on the platform, but his mind perhaps still in the supermarket aisle, where just weeks earlier, he had stopped a former commissioner mid-step by holding out a photograph of his brother. The commissioner's attempt to push past had been caught on camera, frozen in that frame, where the photo blocked his chest, the look on his face, a mixture of recognition and fear, and it had spread with a speed that made denial impossible. Near the fountain, a cluster of college students huddled together, whispering as the platform remained empty for the moment. One of them had been part of the group that projected data onto the precinct walls in the dead of night, the glowing numbers visible across the plaza, until morning, forcing even those who looked away to see them. Their presence here now felt like the continuation of a ledger being balanced. The crowd was dense but not restless. There was no jostling, no raised signs, no shouts cut in the cold. The sound of the wind moving between the buildings filled the pauses, carrying with it scents from the food carts lined at the far edge: roasting chestnuts, spiced coffee, the faint sweetness of baked bread, and beneath it the sharper tang of the metal stand waiting at the center. A pigeon fluttered down briefly to the corner of the platform before lifting off again, startled by nothing in particular, just the sheer collective focus of the people arrayed in the plaza. No one seemed to look at anyone else for long. Eyes traveled forward, then settled as though the space between them and the microphone was a kind of bridge that only one person at a time could cross. Somewhere to the left, the creak of a camera tripod broke the even hum, the sound familiar to many in the crowd, reporters who had been here before, covering other reckonings, other faces. But today, there was no scramble for the best angle, no elbows nudging for a clearer shot. The best angle was anywhere because nothing here would be hidden. In the shadow of the municipal building, the windows reflected the scene on itself. The crowd doubled in glass, the platform, a fixed point between stone and sky. No music, no banners, no applause, only the weight of presence, faces lined with years, eyes steady with memory, bodies that had known the cold shadow of injustice, pressing down. Shouter was first. He stepped to the microphone, with the gait of someone walking into a space where escape was impossible. His shoulders neither squared in defiance, nor slumped in surrender, but held in that narrow, fragile balance that betrays a man's uncertainty about whether he can stand through what comes next. His eyes scanned the crowd,
And for the first time in the long arc of his career, there was no uniform to lean on, no badge to catch the light and frame him in the authority he had once worn like armor. The plaza's open air seemed to press against him, colder than it should have been, stripping away the comfortable weight of symbols that had shielded him for decades. Somewhere in the massive faces, a teenager raised her phone, the lens catching the faint tremor in his jaw, an image that before the hour ended, would circulate online alongside footage from months earlier, when he had barked orders over the cries of a woman pressed against a squad car. He cleared his throat, the sound dry and unsteady, as if the air had drawn out the moisture and left him with nothing but grit. I am. The next word never came. It hovered at the edge of his mouth, like a shadow, ready to break away, but whatever courage or pride it required dissolved under the collective gaze of those before him. From the front row, a man in a worn wool coat stood perfectly still. The same man who had once been shoved into a holding cell on Shouter's command, now a fixture in countless shared images of that day, his stare carrying the weight of the hours he had lost. Shouter swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the paper in his hand, though his grip on it slackened as if even the pre-written lines had betrayed him. Behind him on the far edge of the stage, another figure shifted, the former precinct lieutenant, who only weeks ago had been filmed leaving a courthouse through a side door, head down, while a group of bystanders read aloud the names from a list of wrongful detentions he had signed off on. No one in the plaza spoke yet. The memory of those images seemed to hang in the air, an invisible chorus tightening around him. From somewhere near the fountain came the slow click of a camera shutter. The photographer, a young woman in a faded scarf, had become known for a single viral frame of Shouter during a community meeting. Caught mid-smirk as an elderly veteran questioned him about a stop and frisk gone wrong. Now her lens fixed on him again, but the expression she captured was stripped of swagger, bare as the wind that moved across the square. Shouter's fingers tightened on the edge of the podium, the knuckles paling as though he were bracing against an unseen blow. Beyond the microphone, he could see a group of shopkeepers standing together, their arms folded, the same group that had once refused service to a council member allied with him. The footage of the moment, menu pulled away, chair unoffered, looping endlessly on local feeds, as an example of quiet, unshakable dissent. The silence in the plaza stretched, each second adding a grain of weight to the moment, until it pressed down on his shoulders like a physical thing. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, leaving only the sound of his uneven breathing, and the faint creak of the stage beneath his shoes. Somewhere in the back, a child coughed, the brief sound slicing through the quiet, like a reminder that life beyond this reckoning continued. Shouter's lips parted once more, but no sound emerged, only the shallow inhale of someone who has reached the boundary between what can be said and what must be endured. His gaze swept the crowd again, but met no faces softened by sympathy, only eyes that had watched too long and too closely to be swayed by pauses or stammers. The crowd did not jeer, did not shout, they simply watched, the kind of watching that turned stillness into judgment.
Pusher followed. His approach was slower, each step deliberate, as though he were measuring the distance not in feet, but in the weight of what it had taken to arrive here. He did not stop until he was squarely before the microphone, the paper in his hand trembling faintly, despite the clean, even lines of the words printed upon it. For a moment he glanced toward the far edge of the plaza, where the crowd pressed close, their faces a mixture of scrutiny and something colder, an absence of belief that this moment could undo anything. Then he began to read, his voice low but clear, carrying over the open space without strain. "To those I wronged," he said, pausing as if to gauge whether the air would accept the words, "and to those who carry the scars of what I did, I offer my apology. I failed to uphold the dignity, the humanity of the people I was sworn to protect." At the word humanity, his voice broke, not with the calculated fracture of someone reaching for sympathy, but with the small involuntary slip that happens when control thins and something unplanned forces its way through. The sound was brief, almost hidden, but it moved through the crowd, like the ripple from a stone dropped into still water. He recovered quickly enough to continue, yet the fissure had already left its mark, fixed in the memory of the moment. Near the front, a teenager with a phone raised high streamed the scene live, her camera catching the shifting expressions of those who had once known Pusher only as a uniform and a threat. In the corner of her frame, a man in a dark coat stood stiffly. The same man who weeks earlier had been filmed trying to slip through a side entrance of a community hall, only to be turned back by volunteers reading aloud a list of names barred from the premises. His among them. Behind him, a woman in a business suit kept her gaze fixed on Pusher, her lips pressed together, the same face captured in another viral clip where she had been cornered in a supermarket aisle by an elderly couple, holding a photograph of their son. Her response had been a tight smile and a hasty retreat, the image spreading faster than her statement ever could. Pusher's hands gripped the paper tighter as he moved through the remainder of his prepared text. By the fountain, an older man leaned on his cane, watching with the same quiet intensity he had shown months ago when, in full view of the courthouse steps, he had handed a sealed indictment to a former precinct commander. Without a word, the cameras catching the moment the commander's fingers froze around the envelope, the plaza seemed to contract slightly as the wind shifted, carrying the sound of Pusher's voice into the surrounding streets, where shopkeepers and passers-by paused to listen without moving close. From the far side, a group of college students huddled together, their murmurs audible between his sentences. One of them was recognized by many in the crowd. She had been the one to project a spreadsheet of wrongful arrest data onto the facade of the police headquarters in the dead of night, the glowing columns and numbers visible for blocks, impossible to look away from. Now she simply watched, her expression unreadable. Marcus stood in the back of the stage area, neither stepping forward nor making any signal that the moment required his approval. His posture was still, his gaze forward, as though his role now was to bear witness rather than to preside. His presence carried no theatrical weight, but those who noticed him seemed to straighten as if his silence added another measure to the gravity in the air. Pusher's voice moved toward its final lines, the paper trembling just enough to catch the light, his breath catching briefly before settling into an even rhythm again. When Pusher reached the end, there was a pause, and in it came a line that caught Marcus's attention. "And I will never again fail to check an ID." At that, Marcus inclined his head once, a single quiet acknowledgement, but did not clap. From the front of the crowd, an elderly black man stepped forward, his frame lean but upright, a polished war medal pinned to his coat that caught the pale winter light with each movement. His voice was steady as he addressed Shouter directly. "Do you see me as a man now?" The question was not shouted. It did not need volume to pierce. Shouter's eyes flickered upward, meeting the man's for a fraction of a second before dropping again as though contact itself was unbearable. The answer was not in words but in the sag of his shoulders, in the way his jaw tightened, a surrender without grace. Just behind them, the cameras caught the image. Shouter's downcast eyes framed against the metal glinting on the chest of the man who had asked the question. And before the hour was out, it was everywhere. The frozen moment dissected by headlines that needed no embellishment. The wind picked up, then brushing past the microphone in a rush that became a low, persistent hiss, a sound that slipped into the space between words like static threading through the air, as though the plaza itself had chosen to remind everyone that words once spoken still had to travel against resistance. An apology was no different. It had to push against the weight of what had already been done. Off to the side, a woman in a heavy scarf was streaming live, her phone held steady on the crowd, her voice narrating the scene with the unflinching clarity of someone who had waited too long to see this. Her feed caught another figure, once a high-ranking officer, standing rigid on the edge of the gathering, his face tightening as a passerby slipped a folded eviction notice into his coat pocket before walking away without a word. The gesture was subtle, almost courteous, but the camera saw it and the clip found its way into millions of timelines before the officer even reached his car. Near the fountain, a younger man in a fitted suit stood alone, his name already tarnished by leaked recordings of him joking about false arrests. He flinched visibly when a group of teenagers walked past, chanting the date of one of his cases like a refrain, the rhythm of their voices mocking in its steadiness. A few steps beyond, leaning against the stone wall of the plaza, a woman who had once been untouchable in city politics was confronted by a former aide holding a manila envelope. The aide's lips moved, delivering words only she could hear, and whatever they were, they left her eyes glassy, her hands frozen mid-gesture, the tableau captured by a still photographer who didn't need to hear the sound to understand the meaning. Marcus had been watching these fragments as if they were shards of a larger mirror, each one reflecting the ways power eroded when it met the air unfiltered. The murmurs around him began to swell, a low tide of voices, neither fully hostile nor forgiving, but heavy with the gravity of what had been witnessed. His coat lifted slightly in the cold breeze, the movement unhurried, the fabric shifting like something alive against his frame. Somewhere behind him, a chair scraped against the stone, the sound, small but distinct as though someone had just stood to leave, unable to bear another moment of being seen. His phone buzzed once in his pocket, the vibration sharp against the stillness he carried. He drew it out, the glass cool against his fingertips, and glanced at the message glowing on the screen. The reform bill draft is ready. Sign. The words were simple, unadorned, carrying none of the noise of the crowd, none of the wind's hiss, only the blunt clarity of a question that could not remain unanswered. The glow from the screen lit his face for a moment, revealing no shift in expression before fading, as he locked it and slid the device back into the deep pocket of his coat. He began to walk, the sound of the wind and the muted voices behind him fading into something else entirely, the pulse of a decision about to be made. The wind from the plaza followed Marcus into his office, carrying with it the faint scent of concrete and cold steel, the kind that seeped into the skin and stayed there long after the moment had passed. The reform bill lay open on his desk, its pages heavy, not with thickness, but with the density of what they contained: mandatory identification checks in all stops, body cameras engaged at all times, disciplinary measures without delay, expedited compensation for wrongful detention, and the establishment of an independent oversight board with powers that could not be muted by politics. Every clause was honed to precision, stripped of rhetoric, fortified by the memory of nights when these safeguards had not existed. It was the sum of months of confrontation, years of endurance, and one long night of public reckoning that had burned away any room for compromise. He stood over it for a moment, his eyes scanning the text, but reading instead the weight behind each word, the weight of people who would never walk through their front doors again, the weight of voices that had been flattened under official reports, the weight of a silence that could not be mistaken for peace. Then, without hesitation, he took the pen from its hold. The nib met the paper with a sharp, decisive contact, and the ink flowed in a steady, controlled line, the sound of it soft but unbroken, like the slow turn of a key in a lock that had been rusted shut for too long. To anyone else it might have been the scratch of a signature. To him it was the sound of nails sealing the coffin of an old order. He closed the document with the crisp fold of a man who had no interest in theatrics. The folder was fastened with the same deliberate care as one might give to closing a will, and when he set the pen aside, it was with the knowledge that its work was finished. Stepping out without an escort, he left the office door ajar, not as an invitation, but as a statement. The corridor smelled faintly of floor polish and dust, its polished brass fixtures reflecting the lean shape of his stride. By the time he reached the lobby, the city's noise had begun to bleed back into the edges of his hearing. The distant blare of a horn, the irregular rhythm of traffic, the overlapping fragments of conversation that made the air feel alive again. As he walked, the low hum of daily life mixed with the occasional voice that recognized him, though none dared stop him. Near the base of the government steps, he passed a former police union head, now reduced to pacing in front of the news cameras that had once served him, trying to defend himself against leaked footage of him laughing over false arrest statistics. The clip had been replayed so many times that the sound of his chuckle had become its form of indictment. 2 blocks later, Marcus caught sight of the plaza's fountain, where a disgraced councilman had been cornered just last month by a group of high school students holding printouts of his voting record. Their voices were steady, their questions precise, and the footage of his face, glassy-eyed and without an answer, had spread faster than any headline, turning into a narrower street. Marcus passed a cafe with wide glass windows, the very place where an ex-judge removed for corruption had been refused his usual table. The owner, once deferential, had met his request with a quiet, "Not today," and the silence in the room afterward had been louder than any jeer. On the next corner, the steps of a bank bore the lingering echo of a different collapse, a former district attorney emerging to find his accounts frozen. The notice handed to him in full view of pedestrians who had filmed the way his hands trembled as he read it. The street beyond was quieter, but each storefront in shadow carried some trace of reckoning, as if the city had decided to archive its memory in the places where it happened. Marcus kept moving, each stride measured, his gaze fixed ahead. He did not pause for photographs or greeting. His destination was neither the courthouse nor the council hall. It was a stretch of asphalt that had once been a stage for humiliation. The street was unchanged in its shape and surface. The same uneven patches of blacktop that shimmered faintly under the morning sun. The same cracks feathering out from old repairs like the veins in weathered stone. The same stretch of curb where his feet had once been forced to part under the unblinking gaze of onlookers who had pretended not to walk. He approached the exact spot where the patrol car's hood had pressed into his ribs. The metal cold and unyielding, the smell of overheated engine oil rising into his face, the click of a camera's shutter freezing his wrists in steel long before the cuffs dug in. The air here still carried the faint tang of exhaust, but it no longer pressed on his chest like that day. Instead, it felt wider, thinner, as though the space itself had been emptied of the power that once suffocated him. He stopped, unbuttoning the front of his vest, letting the cool air touch him with a deliberate calm that years ago would have been mistaken for defiance. The sidewalk across from him bore the silent witnesses of another fall. The corner store's doorway, where just weeks before, a former precinct captain had been shoved by the crowd into a rack of newspapers after trying to slip a cent unnoticed, the slap of papers against the tile floor drowning out his muttered excuses. Farther down, near the bus stop, the wall still bore the faint outline of graffiti that had been scrubbed away too late to save the image from circulating online. A crude sketch of a gavel crushing a badge, shared millions of times with the caption, "Not above the law." He stepped forward slowly until his shoes stood exactly where his heels had once scraped against the pavement. The sensation almost tactile in his memory, the grit of sand under the leather, the heat of humiliation rising his spine. The road had not changed, but the man standing on it had. His presence now was not a target to be pinned, but an anchor, rooted and unmovable. Across the street, a delivery truck idled while its driver leaned on the horn at a man in a tailored suit, blocking the loading zone. His argument cut short when a passerby began live streaming, narrating with relish how the man had once signed eviction notices for tenants he'd never met. The clip, already viral by midday, ended with him retreating under the weight of a silence heavier than any shouted insult. He lifted his eyes from the asphalt, tracing the line of the curb to the doorway of the diner, where another scene had played out. An officer stripped of his badge, only hours before, had been refused service. Not with shouts, but with the simple closing of a menu in front of him. The waitress's voice steady as she said, "We don't serve your kind here." The phrase turning on itself with a fizzing that needed no elaboration. The glass in the diner's windows caught the morning light and threw it back in fractured patterns across the street, landing on the small rectangle of metal set into the ground just beyond the crosswalk. He moved toward it, the sound of his steps quiet but measured, passing beneath the overhang of a storefront, whose owner had once refused to hand over surveillance footage, only to watch her business emptied by a boycott that arrived without picket signs. Just the absence of customers day after day until the locks were changed. At the edge of the sidewalk, the new sign waited, its surface gleaming faintly as though it had been polished before dawn. The lettering was deliberate in its austerity, stripped of embellishment, each character carrying the weight of something that could not be argued away. The letters were plain, no flourish in the font, no ornament beyond the authority of their statement. "Check My Identity Act enforced here." He read it once without blinking, the words slotting into place in his mind as both a marker and a warning. Marcus lifted his eyes, taking in the buildings that lined the block, their brick faces weathered with a kind of dignity that belonged to neither victory nor defeat, but to endurance itself. No crowd gathered, no applause followed him here. This was not a place for spectacle, only a place for ending things. "Justice doesn't make noise," he said under his breath. The words clipped, final. "It finishes." The syllables disappeared into the air, claimed by the city's ordinary hum, meant for no one else, as if they were a private transaction between his conscience and the quiet streets that had borne witness to more than anyone would admit. He stood still for 3 beats, the pause deliberate, the kind that settles into memory without the need for photograph. His gaze fixed not on any one door or window, but on the invisible residue of moments past, the shouts that had once ricocheted off these walls, the footsteps that had fled or chased, or stood their ground. A faint breeze lifted the edge of his coat, carrying with it the metallic scent of last night's rain, mixed with something sharper, like rust from an unchained gate. Somewhere down the block, a shopkeeper rattled open a security shut, the clatter momentarily masking the distant sound of tires screeching as a delivery truck braked. Marcus's hands remained in his pockets, fingers brushing the folded slip of paper that had ignited all of this. The document whose ink was still fresh enough to smear if he thought of the first man who had scoffed when the subpoenas arrived, laughing into a television camera about paper tigers and waste of taxpayer dollars, only to be photographed weeks later being escorted out of his own office by federal agents, while the employees he had underpaid for years lined the hallway, clapping slowly, deliberately, and mercilessly. He thought of another, the one who had once struck a deal in the shadows of a courthouse stairwell, certain that the whispers of bribery would never crawl into the daylight, being forced to walk through a gauntlet of protesters, whose chant didn't need his name because his face was enough to identify the rot. Marcus turned, continuing down the sidewalk, passing a corner cafe where the morning crowd glanced up at him without recognition. It was better that way. On a nearby television mounted above the counter, a news clip replayed footage of a city councilman being denied entry into the very gala he had sponsored, the bouncer reading from a printed list of barred guests while cameras capturing the precise moment the man realized he had become a pariah in the rooms he once controlled. Marcus didn't linger. His footsteps carried him onward steady, without a backward glance, the rhythm of his gait as unyielding as the work that had brought him here. Across the street, a bus shelter bore a fresh advertisement that no one seemed to notice. A single image of a courthouse door chained shut with the words "reopened" stamped across it in red. It was a campaign no one had claimed credit for, but Marcus knew it was not about credit. It was about permanence. At the corner he paused again, watching as a suited man in his 50s hurried from a taxi toward the entrance of a bank, only to be stopped by a woman in a clerk's uniform, who held out a notice of asset seizure. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gesture for the benefit of onlookers. She simply handed over the paper, her eyes unwavering, and the man's shoulders sagged under the sudden awareness that every pane of glass on that block reflected his undoing. Marcus walked on, the street narrowing as he moved deeper into the older part of the city, where the bricks were darker and the lamplight clung stubbornly to the edges of alleys. The smell of baking bread drifted from a basement window, warm and incongruous against the cold metal of the day's truths. In the next morning's edition of the city paper, buried at the bottom of page 7 beneath a column about municipal budgets, was a single line of 217 closed cases reopened under the new law. There was no commentary, no flourish, just the plain fact and the quiet knowledge that for some, the weight of the past had just shifted.